I'm giving a talk on cloud security monitoring. So originally this talk was kind of titled Cloud Security Monitoring for Startups. I work at a startup, so it's kind of geared in that direction, but I'm going to try to make it relevant to organizations of different sizes, companies that are huge, tiny, depending on what you're doing with your career today. Something else I should note is we wrote 2 pretty detailed blog posts on this topic, so if you have a question about like how we did something in detail or very specifically, it's on the internet. I'll point a link to it at the end. So that kind of avoids the situation of here's 1,000 bullet points in my slides, because you can just read the blog posts. Here's the mouse pointer. Kind of an outline. I'll talk about who I am, who this talk is for, why we did what we did, what we ended up doing after a while, and then how we got there. So we are a startup, and the company is called Auth0. We do identity in the cloud, like you can outsource your authentication and authorization for your app, for your website, for your employees, customers, whatever. Obviously, that puts us in a very sensitive part of a company's workflow. Not everybody wants to outsource their authentication, especially to a startup. So when I joined about 1.5 years ago, I was like employee number 40 or 45. Pretty small company, and we didn't have a lot going on. Before Auth0, I was with Amazon for 4 years. I'm going backwards. Before that, I worked at the NSA for about 10 years. I can say that now. It's all on WikiLeaks. There's no secrets left. And before that, I worked at what used to be Bell Labs, became AT&T. So I've been in security for a while, longer than most people nowadays. But after a while at Amazon, I just got the itch to join a startup. And I was the first security hire at the company, so you can imagine there wasn't a lot there when I joined. Now we do have a few people, and these 3 guys on the bottom did a lot of the work that kind of came after I joined, when I hired the team. So definitely want to give them credit. When I made this slide, I didn't realize there'd be people in the room who recognized someone on here. But the idea is this is how I'm going to represent the 3 different kinds of organizations. So the top right, those crazy people in the ocean, that's one of our founders and some of our engineering team during a company offsite a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, when they were in Mexico, there was a hurricane like a week beforehand, so it was a little crazy. But that's what startups do. They just kind of jump in, see what happens, they take risks, not a lot of planning, just go with the flow. So this talk is definitely how we at Auth0 did security monitoring from scratch. And if you're at a startup, it's going to make a lot of sense. You can probably relate to it and actually follow the steps if you wanted to. This person over here using his standing desk incorrectly is a friend of mine at Amazon. And Amazon will probably be another organization that does very similar things for security monitoring, but at a gigantic scale. So where I might be collecting gigabytes a day at a startup, they're collecting terabytes, depending on what data set you're looking at. And some of this stuff doesn't scale one-to-one, but the theory of it does. So they're going to try to achieve the same goals, but using vastly different tools, probably stuff they develop in-house. But at the end of the day, they still want to get data to analysts, they want to have alerts, they want to do monitoring. That generic-looking office building, that is probably a security vendor. Something I found working at a startup is a lot of the enterprise tools just don't really work for us. We have a very different environment, we have a different culture. We can't just plug in Suricata at our border. We can't buy an IDS from some company. We don't have Windows laptops. There's a lot of stuff that the enterprise security market sells that I don't have any use for. It doesn't stop the salespeople from calling me 20 times a day, but I really can't buy a lot of it. So if you are a vendor or work at a company like that, don't forget about the startups. Maybe there's another market out there. I mean, there is a lot of venture capital. So people have the money, they just don't necessarily have the right tools available. So why do we even want to bother, right? We're a startup. We have a business. We want to see if our company can, find product market fit. Is someone going to pay us for what we're building? At the same time, we're in a very sensitive field in terms of authentication and authorization. these guys and these compliance regimes are a good motivator. So when you're doing authentication and you're trying to sell to a Fortune 500 company, they're going to have a lot of questions about how you do security. That logo in the middle is from SOC 2, which is basically a certification that says a third-party auditor has reviewed our security practices and policies. We paid them some money. They wrote up a 200-page report, and it says that we do security okay. Trust us. You can't really do that unless you have monitoring and a whole other bunch of security stuff in place. And luckily, Auth0 decided to do this like 3 years ago when the company was really young. And so we had the foundation, we had the policies, the procedures, at least in theory, they're written down that we would do these things. And that made it a lot easier when I showed up. So some startups do care about security a little bit early on. Another reason that you might want to do some monitoring is no matter the size of your company, if you have a major incident or a breach, there's going to be fallout. It could be reputational, it could be financial. If you're a small enough company, it can put you out of business in 3 days. Like if we got taken down from a DDoS, in about a week, I think we'd have no customers, to be really honest. So same thing if we had a breach, because we hold tens of millions of usernames and passwords for some of our customers. If those got out, they would stop paying us very quickly, and we'd probably get sued very quickly. So those are good motivators. Our CEO is very much in favor of doing security so we don't go out of business. Yeah, it's still a cost center, but it's kind of a necessary one. I had to put a cat picture in the presentation somewhere. So yes, we all know there's no shortage of threats. I don't need to tell this audience that. Another reason we focus on cloud for security monitoring is that this looks absolutely nothing like our network or our infrastructure. This is very traditional. This is how it was when I started working 15 years ago. You have your laptop sitting out there protected by a million layers of stuff. Nowadays, we're kind of just on the internet, right? We don't have a NIDS. We don't have lots of firewalls or DMZs. The office looks more like this. Everyone's on their laptop. They could be at Starbucks, or they could be sitting in our headquarters office, which has Wi-Fi, but it's almost as good as Starbucks because you don't get any special access by being on the internal network. You're just sitting in an office that has Wi-Fi. All your stuff is in the cloud. They're using Dropbox, they're using GitHub, Google Apps, all the stuff that you get as a startup because it's cheap and easy. You're not going to set up an Exchange server. You don't know if you're going to be in business 6 months from now, right? The interesting is a lot of larger companies that want to be as agile as a startup are also going down this route. So if you go to like a Netflix where they have maybe 2,000 or 3,000 employees doing really high-end engineering, they're still using Google Apps. They're still using GitHub. They're in the cloud a million different ways, just like we are. So they have to start solving similar problems on a larger scale. But just because they've been around for 20 years and make a lot of money doesn't mean they're not in the cloud. And when you are in the cloud, boy, do you have a lot of choices in what you can use. I found a similar slide that was probably more dense than this for just marketing apps. I don't know, the marketing people have like 1,000 apps for everything they do, and they have ridiculous names. But if you're a developer or you're building tools for developers or other businesses, you're probably using a good number of these tools. And even if you're a large enterprise, you might not know it, but your engineers are still using a bunch of these tools. The difference is we don't have shadow IT. Shadow IT is just our IT, right? It's okay if you use Dropbox, Google Apps. You can put proprietary data out there. Everything is on Amazon, Azure, Google Cloud. It doesn't matter. And my company, Auth0, is down there on the right with a red arrow because we're part of the solution and part of the problem, depending on your perspective. If you're at a big company that's looking at using a company like mine, you're going to have a lot of questions, and you might not trust us at first. And we'll go through that dance. But I was actually shocked at how many of our customers choose to outsource things like authentication. As a security guy, that's a little scary. But if you're building a new product and you just want it to work, you want to focus your engineering time on what makes you unique and where the business value is, you might not want to spend 3 months developing social login for 10 different sites and hooking up Active Directory and Federation and SAML and all these things. And that's basically the value proposition behind a lot of these companies. If you think your developers aren't using them, you're probably wrong. So the key is to kind of get in front of it and hook up your monitoring that works with what people are really using. So here's what we did. We wanted to kind of acknowledge that security and monitoring in general are part of this loop. It's called the OODA loop. I'm sure everyone has kind of seen it. Security doesn't start on day one and finish in 6 months, right? That's not a project that you're done with. Monitoring helps inform a lot of it. It gives you the data you need to make a good decision, and in the end, do something differently. If you're doing incident response, this makes a lot of sense. If you're designing a product that has security features in it, you might also need to do kind of a process-based approach, whereas you're not just finished with a feature, you might need to make security improvements to it continuously. The nice thing about monitoring is it gives you data that lets you do all these things better. So it does have a pretty high value proposition. Another thing that makes startups kind of different is our culture. This quote is slightly cheesy, a little cliched, but we do actually trust our employees. We trust them to do the right thing for the company, which means we give them a lot of access. Everyone has admin on their computers. A lot of people can SSH to production hosts because if there's an outage or a critical bug, they need to fix it. Not in 3 days, but like in 3 minutes. We try to hire people who we can trust. Of course, there's no guarantees, but this is our motto. So what this basically ends up doing is we give people access, but we monitor what they do. We try not to have a big brother kind of feel to the company where we're like watching every keystroke. But we might be collecting every keystroke and looking at it later. If something does go wrong, we want to have the data to go back and do an investigation. And we also want to know in advance, if we can, when there might be an incident so we can get ahead of it. Without monitoring, it's really hard to do this because you can't verify. You can say, yeah, we trust everybody. And then when you're having a conversation with your customer or your CEO when something goes wrong, you're like, well, what were you doing? You were just trusting people? Like, that's really not a solution. So monitoring gives us the ability to do a lot of stuff. If you have the data, you can really enable awareness of your environment. That could be just trolling through your logs, doing ad hoc queries. It could be setting up things like visualization where you can spot patterns. Like maybe you can figure out on an average day we have this many logins. If there's a spike, that'll be very obvious with visualization, things like that. Misuse detection is also a very common scenario because we give a lot of people access, but we don't give everyone all the access. So if an engineer is banging against an API in AWS and they're getting permission denied every 3 minutes, we'll notice that and we'll go to fix it if we can confirm that they're doing something they should be doing. So we don't want to block them, we want to actually enable them. Similarly with change detection, we have a DevOps kind of mindset, we have an operations team, we have developers who go in and touch Amazon infrastructure. If they're adding security groups, we want to know. If they're opening SSH to the internet, we want to know about that. Rather than block them from doing stuff, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And then if we get an alert in 10 minutes, we'll ask them. Similar for incident detection. I didn't write intrusion detection because that's kind of a loaded term, but if we can detect something that's clearly malicious, obviously that's a win. Without this data, without these tools, we can't really do that. And incident response, I think, benefits from as much data as possible. So you can never collect too much data for IR. This is kind of a sampling of the tools we use that are mostly in the cloud. Well, I guess they're all in the cloud. Even our syslog is basically in the cloud because it's running on an EC2 instance, right? And the list on the right is some of the tools we looked at. So when I showed up at Auth 0, we checked that security monitoring box by sending all our CloudTrail alerts into a Slack channel. That was like 30,000 a day, whatever, right? Yes, the Amazon people are shaking their heads. It's obviously no one can read that. It's like piping a log file to your console. It'll just scroll by and you're never going to look at that window, right? So yes, that was technically good enough for a few months. I think the first thing I did was turn that off because it's a waste of resources and no one's looking at it. And then I looked at a couple other tools, but we ended up using Sumo Logic because it's in the cloud. It has a lot of features that are similar to tools that are really good like Splunk. It's not very expensive compared to Splunk. And I didn't go with a free tool like Elasticsearch, for example, because I was the only security engineer. Our operations team was way too busy, and I didn't want to be running my own infrastructure, because then I'm not really doing the security side of it. I'm wasting time with Kibana and Elasticsearch and whatever else needs to be kept online. So you do have a lot of options. Some of the other tools are not bad. Loggly is okay, Graylog is fine, but you have to run it yourself. Splunk has a cloud-hosted thing, so you can try them out, but Sumo Logic is what we used. So I'll talk about a little bit how we got there, what we did. It's actually very simple. The nice thing about Sumo Logic is you can ingest data lots of different ways. So we can do syslog data, and we can get CloudTrail data that's sitting in S3. We can hook up webhooks so that like GitHub can automatically push data to a URL. That's the thing with these cloud tools. They all want to get data to you different ways. Some of them are really easy. You just give a URL. Some of them are really annoying. So you want to make sure you pick something that supports all the tools you're going to use. Easier said than done. Maybe it won't happen. But there's a lot of value in having all your data in one place, especially for things like incident response, where time is of the essence. You don't want to have to query 3 different tools to get your stuff. You don't want to have to go to Google's console. You don't want to have to go to Dropbox and GitHub and try to consolidate things there. And also for correlation. If you're going to correlate any kind of alerts, they really should be in one tool, or else you're going to be writing a lot of custom code to do that later. And that little hashtag icon, I guess everybody knows by now, is Slack. We're a very remote-first company, so we do everything on Slack. And Sumo Logic has a really good integration where you can send alerts to Slack. You can kind of actually go back and forth and interact with it. I'll show that later. And it also has a bunch of really nice visualizations, kind of like dashboards that management loves, but is also useful from an engineering or analyst perspective. One nice thing is that every square in that visualization actually has a search behind it. And you can tweak those searches to change the visualization. You can also use them to make alerts or reports. So you don't have to start from scratch. And if you're a startup or a very small company without a lot of security people, that gives you a huge running start. I think I got this up and running in a matter of like 3 weeks. It was actually pretty useful in generating real alerts. So it's very quick, and that's a good thing if you're a small company. Here's an example of one of the visualizations of our CloudTrail data. I think I have the same screenshots on our blog post, so you don't have to squint. But it'll give you useful information that you can see who's failing to log in. Is that really the user or someone trying to brute force? Hopefully you have 2-factor authentication turned on. And then it's got a bunch of pie charts, which may or may not be useful. Similarly, there's some stuff built in for Linux systems. If you look at that one on the top left, there's clearly a spike. They are successful logins, but that could also be an issue, right? Is there an operational problem? Is there someone who guessed the password correctly and now is logging into every system? Depends on your environment, but this will help you kind of just get a lay of the land a bit. The geolocation stuff can be handy if your company is not very distributed, especially, because you're like, well, I don't have anyone in Romania. Why is there a login from Romania? It's a little harder in our environment because we have people probably in like 30 countries. Given we have 200 employees, we're very, very distributed, but it's still helpful. Like Africa, maybe no one's in Africa. That has actually come up before, where it's been useful to see the map. Google Apps, if you're using Google Apps, this is really kind of a critical part of your infrastructure that is easy to ignore. It's got a lot of sensitive data in there in Google Docs, in emails. Calendar events even can be super sensitive if your CEO is meeting with venture capitalists or thinking about merging with another company. There's a lot of data in there that would be interesting from a corporate espionage perspective or social engineering perspective. A lot of our phishing emails come in through there. Most of them get blocked, but certainly not all of them. This was a built-in graph that Google provides for Sumo Logic. So it's a very good head start. Here's kind of an example. It's a simplified query. If you know Splunk, this looks very similar to Splunk, which is why I love Sumo Logic, because I used Splunk for years. And it's an example of what an alert looks like in Slack. This is an alert that says something in CloudTrail changed. So you're going to use CloudTrail to monitor AWS. You probably want an alert when that turns off. The nice thing is it does log itself when it turns off. And if that goes to Sumo Logic, it's already centrally logged. In 3 minutes, you can get an alert in Slack and go see what happened. This was from a real incident that we detected. There were more alerts than this, but these were kind of the key ones. That first one basically says that there were some failed logins to Amazon AWS from Latvia, someone trying to run IAM get users. So someone basically looking to see what permissions do I have and failing. It's kind of silly, but failed attempts against AWS are actually a pretty high signal alert. In this case, it was coming from Latvia, which is a country we don't have any people in, especially not this user. So we pretty quickly asked him, like, are you traveling? Is this you? And then when the alerts kept coming in, we kind of realized, no, it's definitely not him. And then we saw his SSH key being used from another country. This alert just says this key was used from more than one country in a short period of time. Either someone's using a VPN or they're traveling really quickly, or their key was stolen. Back in the day, we used to have SSH open to the internet, unfortunately. We don't do that anymore, but again, a startup. So yeah, basically we had a Strider incident, which is like kind of like Jenkins, continuous deployment. Out on the internet, he had a really weak password. Somebody guessed it. When you're in a Strider-like system, there's like 50 different SSH keys because it's deploying software to all our fleet. And so someone grabbed a key, logged in, started poking around. I'm not sure we would have found this if we were manually scanning CloudTrail alerts. It would probably be buried in the channel somewhere, and we'd never know until he spun up like another Bitcoin miner, which happened before too. So moral of the story is you can actually find real incidents with monitoring. We all know that. The point is you can do it really easily and pretty cheaply with something like Sumo Logic and Slack. We also do some just daily reporting. So we give people a lot of access, like I said. If they're attaching policies, changing security groups, once a day we get a report. An engineer looks through this and says, yeah, that makes sense, or this is weird, I should follow up. It doesn't take a lot of time. You can click through these and just say, yeah, it's good or it's not. The little thumbs up is kind of our process. You can call it a process. When somebody looks at it and it looks good, you give it a thumbs up. Simple, it works. Probably won't work if your team is 50 people, but for us it works. This is something else we developed pretty recently. We wanted to kind of get a handle of what was going on in GitHub because all our code is there. An engineer wrote a little bot that takes stuff from GitHub and gives you these little buttons. You can approve or reject. This is what you see in Slack. It's basically a sanity check, like should this user be adding this user to this team with this access? It uses a couple of different technologies that we have called WebTask and Slask. That's basically just a way of running a process and giving you these buttons. It's not particularly difficult. We actually open sourced that little bot that you can use to do this right now. And to be honest, it's been a little noisy, so we're still working on it. Like maybe I don't really care every single GitHub change. I might need to filter this down. Right now the channel is full of like 20 things that no one's pushed the button on. So yeah, it's not a perfect process, but you can use this for a lot of other stuff too. I'm running out of time, so I'm going a little faster. When? Yes, you should probably be doing this now. If you're using the cloud, if you think you're not using the cloud, you probably are, so you might want to do it anyway. Don't ignore this stuff. Get the data out of those systems to somewhere where you can use them and actually alert on them. Pick a platform that works for your company. You might have to build something if you're at a higher scale. If you have the money, you might want to buy something like Splunk. Sumo Logic works for us. The key is really to collect the right data, put it in the right place, and then not just ignore it. So, like I said, a Slack channel full of data is not really data. It's just a dumping ground. And yeah, make sure your staff has the skills to use the tools you're talking about. A lot of traditional security folks don't yet really have some of the cloud security skills. None of this is rocket science though, so give them a couple of weeks, let them do some training. I think just about anyone can figure it out. Just in time. That URL will give you the post we wrote, and if you want to hit me up on Twitter with any questions or comments, that's also cool. Do I have time for questions now?
Yes.
Yep, got time. John?
So you showed some alerts in your Slack channel there.
Mm-hmm.
How many alerts are you dealing with on a daily basis? Are you dealing with alert fatigue
Right.
on your team? So
That's a good question. The question was, how do we deal with alert fatigue? What's our scale of alerts? Right now, this works for us because we don't have a lot of alerts, maybe a dozen in a given day. Right, it's kind of spread out. We have 24-hour coverage from time zones. If I was going to be doing maybe like twice that rate, I would get something different. I think I might need a dedicated tool or more automation, either through chatbots or something similar. Because some of these alerts, we could probably automate the response to a degree. If it's an alert about a permissions problem, we might just message the user automatically and give them one of those buttons. Hey, was this you or not you? I think Slack, the company Slack, does some of that too. So it's not a weird pattern, and I assume they have a lot more alerts than we do. So that's kind of our plan for the future. Chatbots. Hey.
Could you give some sort of estimate on how much sort of software you're using that you rely on for security that's built in-house versus outside stuff?
The question was, how much software are we using in-house for security? Not much. The stuff we wrote are a lot of bots. We wrote our own little bot framework that we open sourced. We do use something called WebTask, which is technically part of Auth0, but is a little bit of a standalone tool. It's like a serverless framework. We can just say, here's this block of code, run it for me. It gives you back a URL. That makes it a lot easier in terms of maintaining infrastructure. There isn't any. It's kind of outsourced to a different part of the company. And we did open source this one Audit bot, but again, that's just like this much code. So it's pretty minimal. I wish we could write more of our own stuff and get more creative, but we don't really have the time or resources at this point.
How much are you taking into Sumo Logic ingestion-wise?
In terms of ingestion to Sumo Logic, we're only doing a couple of gigs a day right now, which is hilariously small compared to bigger companies. Yeah.
Can you give me stats of the size of your deployment you have?
Sure. Our deployment in the cloud, we're in like a few hundred instances, several regions. We're a startup. We're not tiny. We've been around for about 3 years and have tens of millions in revenue, I can say. About 200 employees, like 50 engineers, something like that. So yeah, it's small scale. I mean, it's not Amazon scale by any means.
Is there a way to tie Sumo Logic to like your employees max? They have
To what?
To like your personal employees' computers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you tie Sumo Logic into that as well?
We have like management software deployed on our laptops, for example, that does send logs to Sumo Logic. And we actually have logs from Auth0 itself because we use that to authenticate our own employees internally. And that helps us kind of tie everything together a lot. We know the identity of an SSH key, an IP address, a MAC address. We can really tie it together. One last question.
Do you see it in their product also, or just for your internal?
So we use it internally. We did work with Sumo Logic to come up with an Auth0 dashboard that you can, if you're a customer of both Auth0 and Sumo Logic, you click a button and you get this cool dashboard with all your logs in it. We're not using it as like an internal analytic or anything, although that would be nice. Thanks. All done.